Monoamines refers to two subfamilies of neurotransmitters, including the indolamines and the catecholamines. We'll begin with the catecholamines. There are three catecholamines: dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. If we look at the synthesis of the catecholamines, you see that it begins with L-tyrosine. That gets converted into L-dopa. L-dopa is the precursor for dopamine. L-dopa gets converted. These enzymes don't matter, but they're here if you wanted to just look into it. The dopa decarboxylase turns L-dopa to dopamine. And as you'll see, dopamine gets converted into norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and norepinephrine gets converted into epinephrine or adrenaline. So it's part of the whole, the entire sequence is right here in front of you, and it's one chemical pathway. So let's begin with dopamine. Precursor is L-dopa. There are four, but there are three major dopamine systems in the brain: the nigrostriatal, the mesolimbic, and the mesocortical. These terms are compound terms. If we split them, we see that the first part refers to where the dopamine is produced. In the case of the nigrostriatal, the niagara refers to the substantia nigra, and striatal refers to the basal ganglia, areas which we'll look at in a different way in the neuroanatomy portion. The meso from the mesolimbic refers to the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, and the limbic in the mesolimbic refers to the nucleus accumbens. Meso from mesocortical again refers to the VTA. And the cortical here, predominantly, I want to point you to the frontal cortex. Now, dopamine, having these three systems, you would imagine that there are three distinct roles, and there are. The nigrostriatal dopamine system is a major component of movement. Specifically, here we're talking about the initiation of voluntary movements. Initiation is the key. This is the go button, if you will, on movement. So right now, I'd love a sip of my coffee, and it's a couple feet away from me. I I had the goal, I planned a movement, but I cannot execute the movement without dopamine. Dopamine, in a way, is a link between your sort of mental world and the physical world where coffee lives. So you need dopamine to turn the idea of yum coffee, vague dreamlike coffee, into the reality of reaching over and grabbing the coffee. This system is implicated in Parkinson's. Where the substantia nigra is degenerating. And the if I had to name one symptom to encapsulate Parkinson's, it would be inability to move intentionally. Okay, the mesolimbic system. This is also critical. This is the role of dopamine in reward and reinforcement. Whenever you feel that feeling, we talked about this in the context of tolerance. This is a system. Whether it's from heroin, getting an A, or getting to run around if you're a dog or if you're one of my kids, this is the system that's implicated. Mesocortical, this is all about high level cognitive processes such as attention and working memory. Here, called it short term memory, working memory is a much better term. Working memory refers to your ability to hold certain amount of information in your mind. So if let's do an auditory, verbal working memory task. And I'm going to say 5 numbers and you try to remember them. 5, 7, 2, 3, 1. Now you say them back to me. That's working memory, easy style. Now tell me the sum of all those numbers. Now that's much higher level working memory. But some of you were able to do it, others weren't. Why? Well, in this case, it's because you weren't paying attention. But there are going to be individual differences, right? With everything we cover, including your abilities. And if you're wondering if these relate back to your dopamine systems, of course they do. And if you're also wondering if this relates to ADHD, it sure does. When we give ADHD medications, we're usually targeting this system. So, movement, reward, and working memory. One thing to know about dopamine drugs, both drugs of abuse and therapeutic pharmaceutical drugs, we're in an era mostly of dumb drugs. You cannot surgically target just this system, for instance. What you want to do if you want to treat Parkinson's, you need to agonize this system to get relief and allow the patient to move. But you can't, you have blowback. You also agonize this and this. So you can have strange behaviors coming from Parkinson's patients. Pleasure seeking. You can have cognitive problems and psychosis. If you agonize the mesocortical system enough, psychosis will follow. Drugs of abuse, which is usually the only time you're really targeting this system, you also cause hyperactivity, as well as cognitive problems, including, and most disturbingly, psychosis. If we're targeting this system, like we do for ADHD, you also cause problems with addictive behaviors. These drugs are addictive. And you can cause hyperactivity depending on the brain you're starting with. So, the point of that was to illustrate again our current dopamine drugs are dumb in that you cannot surgically target one system. If you want to increase one, you're going to increase all of them. With blocking, you can be slightly more selective, but not really. Okay, now let's talk about some drugs that affect the dopamine system. The classic, some of the classic drugs of abuse, amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine, all are potent um, dopamine agonists, work in different ways. Potency, definitely number one. You could argue about two and three. Methylphenidate is Ritalin, still used. Adderall is preferred, I think, by a lot of people. ADHD drugs, dopamine agonists. On the other end of the spectrum, we have chlorpromazine. This is a dopamine type 2 receptor blocker, D2 blocker. And this is an antipsychotic. And when these came out, it led to such a change in psychiatry as we know it. And in the schizophrenia portion at the very end of the class, I'll come back to this topic.